species and just say that, well, over here, instead of just considering one species as n, we'll expand it to two species as n. And in this case, we have to have two equations because we want to know what the effect is on one species on the other and vice versa. So you'll notice that down here the notation is for having species 1 and species 2 in its population sizes, and species 1 and species 2 in its population sizes. But notice that we've added another term here, which is alpha and beta, and those are the competition coefficients that say something about how strong the effect of competition is of one species on the other. Okay. So we're expanding this now to, say, two species, and this allows us to think about it interspecifically by considering the total amount of resources that both species are competing for and therefore influencing each other the way one species would have influenced itself up here. So it's a pretty easy extension. So it was Lotka and Volterra that did this as well, these competition equations, just like they did for predator-prey relationships. So what they did was come up with these diagrams again to illustrate how these equations might work in individual situations and then combine them to understand how the two species might behave. So in this case, we have two graphs, and one of them is indicating the carrying capacity and effects for species 1, and the other one is considering species 2. So the isocline here is something that's movable, right? It can slide around. And if species 1 is at carrying capacity, for example, then it's, maybe it's balanced here. So you've got species 2 population density and species 1 population density. And this is for species 1 only. And so when it's at carrying capacity, the population is balanced because it's not able to grow past carrying capacity, and the environmental resistance is resisting growth in that direction. And the same thing's happening for species 2 at its carrying capacity. Right? So the two lines here are representing carrying capacity relationships for each species independently of the other one. So if we want to consider competition, then we want to put these two together, and then you get the Lotka and Volterra competition equations represented in a graphical way. And so there's 4 different possibilities here, and these represent different outcomes of competition that are possible given different numerical situations in the equations. So what this is suggesting here is if you look at the position of the lines, so each of those represents carrying capacity relationships for each species. So what's going to happen in these various panels depends upon how species are affecting each other, right? So if one species is a much better competitor than the other one, then we've already seen what happens in a laboratory experiment, right? One species exploits the resources efficiently, the other one doesn't. The one that's inefficient gets outcompeted. So what we should expect to see graphically then is one species that's got a much higher carrying capacity than the other one. That's bad for the species that has a poor ability to exploit the resources. It's more likely to be outcompeted. And so in these two situations, they're reversed, right? So species 1's a better competitor, species 2's a better competitor. What's going to happen in the other situations, if a species limits itself more than its competitors do, then what you're saying is they're able to coexist with their competitor, and they're limited more by their own consumption of resources than what their competitor is doing to them. And in that case, we would expect the two species to coexist. Right? And that could happen in two ways. It could be in a very stable way, where the two populations kind of balance each other. They both exist at carrying capacity because they're influencing themselves more than the competitors influencing them. And so therefore they both balance out at carrying capacity, and they have a nice stable relationship, right? Indicated by the arrows all pushing toward this stability point. But the other possibility is they're balanced, but then one species gains an advantage because it becomes more abundant, and it causes the other one to decline in numbers. In that case, there'd be an unstable coexistence, which could push either species to extinction if the other one gains the advantage. All right, so Locke and Volterra had several different predictions based on how species were affecting each other. And this is really the explanation for what we would expect to see. Stable coexistence in situations where the carrying capacity is influenced mainly by the species itself instead of competitors, or a superior competitor outcompeting an inferior one, or one gaining an advantage simply because it suddenly has some circumstance makes it more abundant, and therefore it's got an advantage in the environment and outcompetes the less common one. So, that's a good general thing to think about. It gives us a good understanding of what might happen given, just assuming a lot of things were equal and the two species just differ in their numbers and how they respond to each other. But, do species really outcompete each other? Because we see situations where there is a superior competitor to another one, but the inferior competitor manages to survive anyway. So, unsurprisingly, ecologists have delved into that and tried to understand why so many species can get packed into an environment when they're not all equally good at competing with each other. How does this work? So, touch on a few examples here that kind of illustrate how species are able to coexist given competition. So, one reason that inferior competitors might still be able to tolerate competition is that the inferior one simply has an environmental tolerance for some stressful condition that the superior competitor doesn't have. Right? So that could be some kind of harsh abiotic condition, and we'll look at some examples that will, illustrate what those might be. But for example, in a seashore environment, high salinity would be stressful for plants. So maybe if you've got a plant that's tolerant of high salinity, even though its competitor isn't, then the inferior one could become adapted to the harsh salinity and escape competition because its superior competitor can't tolerate it. And disturbance is a similar kind of environmental problem for species. They may tolerate it well or not. So examples are coming up for those. Now something else that's more complex, but the concept's pretty simple, but the number of species involved makes it complex. Suppose you have a scenario where some species plays a really key role in understanding the interactions between competitors. Right? So let's just refer to this for now as a consumer resource influence. Maybe one of the competitors is more vulnerable to predation than the other ones. And that would mean there's a disproportionate effect on the superior competitor, and its numbers would be reduced by the predator, allowing all the competing species to do better than they would if that predator wasn't around. So we have two things going on here. We've got differential predator susceptibility. Everybody isn't equally harvested by the predator. And then we've got what we want to So we'll look at an example or two of keystone predators and how they operate. So first of all, what would be an environmental stress that would influence competition? Disturbance is a good example of an environmental influence that affects competitive outcomes. So, for example, fire is a good form of disturbance. It happens most places sometimes, but some places are very fire prone and others are not. And in either case, fire doesn't affect all species equally. Some species are tolerant of fire and others are not. So, for example, if you're a grass species, most of your biomass is underground. So what if the top of the ground burns? Right? You can grow back. And this is why grasslands tend to be fire tolerant. Prairies burn quite a bit on a natural basis because they get a lot of dry stuff during certain seasons. It burns very, very well, and all you need is a good spark there, and you got a fire. But it doesn't kill the grass, it comes right back. But it sure kills trees, right? A lot of trees do not like that form of disturbance, but some of them tolerate it quite well. It depends on how thick their bark is and how intense the fire is. So a well-established large tree with very thick bark will insulate the growing tissue beneath it, and the fire comes and goes. Maybe it doesn't kill the tree. It just scorches part of the trunk or something, and it continues to survive. But a lot of the other stuff that's growing around it is killed off, and it has to regenerate over time. So what happens with this, for example, if you wanted to look at a fire-tolerant landscape, the southeastern U.S., which is largely pine trees when it's allowed to undergo its natural disturbance regime, stays mostly pine forest in those situations, unless you suppress the fire, and then it gives these other species a competitive advantage because they're not being removed by the disturbance. So we should expect to see differences in the community structure of fire-suppressed and non-fire-suppressed situations in the same general region, simply because of what disturbance does to competitive situations. So, here's another example of differential susceptibility, which is what we kind of just said about fire. Suppose it's a predator this time instead of a disturbance problem. In this case, this biotic relationship, we've got a plant and an animal example here. So on the left, we've got animals, and again, aquatic systems are really good for understanding these things, because going back to stuff from very early in the course, you can study aquatic systems in mesocosms, right? So you can set up little kiddie pools or other smallish containers and set up experiments in each one of them and manipulate some key things to see what happens to the community. So that's undoubtedly what was done here, because you notice how small the numbers are, right? So we're going to take three different competing herbivores: spadefoot toads, southern toads, and spring peepers. And we got them in artificial ponds, and they coexist in real ponds. But they stocked these probably with a number of each one. We don't know how many in this case. And then there's a predatory treatment that varies from pond to pond. And that is how many newts, which is a big carnivorous salamander that would eat the tadpoles, are in each pond. And it varies from 0 to a rather high number. And look what happens here at 0. This is the control, right? So there's no predator at all. So who does the best? You have an obvious superior competitor, the spadefoot toad, that survives at a very high level. So the reason it does well and the spring peeper doesn't do well is because this guy is genetically programmed to be a good competitor. It lives in competitive situations. It's adapted for being an excellent competitor, and it outcompetes the other tadpoles. Right? So it gobbles up all the food, it grows quickly, at the expense of everybody else that lives there. Competitive, almost competitive exclusion in this case. What happens if you add the predator, though? Well, the one that's eating and growing fast is also the most susceptible to predation because it's swimming around and eating all the time. It attracts the attention of the predator, so it gets disproportionately removed from the community by the predator. And the more predators you have, the poorer that species does. And the benefit is to the inferior competitors who now do as well or better than the superior competitor when the predation pressure is high. Right? So what you've got here is species that benefit from the presence of the predator. They're, when there's any predators present at all, the spring peeper does quite well, but the spade-foot toad doesn't like predators one bit. So, anyway, this is getting into what the role of predators might be in affecting competitive outcomes. Got the same thing over here. We've got a plant plot in some managed landscape, and you've got two different plants here dominating, right? And in one case, we've got an herbivore removing this plant, and in the other case, no herbivore removing that plant. And you can see directly how important that single herbivore effect might be on plant community structure. So, no predator, presence of a predator, you get a little bit of this plant, but a lot of other things are allowed to grow in there because the competition is reduced. So, anyway, what we've kind of just been describing predators is actually got a name. The keystone predator concept is actually described by the role of a key predator. The keystone species is usually a predator. It's exerting its influence on the prey species, which are competing with each other. So a really good example of this, it's used all the time, is in marine systems. And we've talked before about mussels, for example, and other bivalves and other mollusks that live in marine systems on rocky substrates, and they compete with each other for space. So you can have a lot of bare rock out there, and it's got barnacles on it, and limpets, and mussels. And those are all mollusks. And then you've got something that eats them. Right? Sea stars eat, they don't move very fast, but when you're eating mussels, you don't have to move very fast. You just climb over top of them and drill into them and eat them. Right? So the importance of the sea star here is that we have a competitive relationship between all of these mollusks. So the mussels are the biggest, and they grow faster, and they outcompete the other ones for space. Right? So if they occupy all the bare rock space, then these other guys have no place to live. They're inferior competitors. They're outcompeted for space. What changes all that is if you bring in the sea star, they're going to eat mostly mussels. And it severely limits the mussel population growth, opening up the space to allow these inferior competitors to survive in that environment when they otherwise would not be able to. And so you can do manipulative experiments where the sea stars are present or they're removed, and you just watch what happens over time. You get very different densities of all of these mollusks, depending upon whether or not this species is there. So this one species influences whether or not the community has mostly one species or a whole bunch of species. And that's why it's a keystone species. It has a disproportionately important influence on how many species are found in the community.
Can that be part of why invasive species may might be able to spread a lot because it's not a predator that's being attacked?
Right, and an invasive species is a great example of understanding competition, because if they come in and although not all species that are introduced are invasive, so depends on how they get along with everybody else that's there. Yeah. Yeah, so we can apply all this stuff later on in the course when we actually try to tie up things and talk about those big picture questions. Conservation issues, endangered species, invasive species, things like that. So this brings us to a point where we can talk about competition in a different way. Exactly how are species exerting their competitive influence on each other? There's a couple of different mechanisms. And they can be subtle or they can be very direct. So a lot of what we've been talking about so far just simply involves resources being consumed at the expense of another species. So if you go back to our algae examples, for example, then we have maybe two species of algae in a container, and they're just both exploiting a resource in the water that they need to grow. Well, the two algae species aren't doing anything to each other directly, they're just consuming a common resource that they both need. But one is much better exploiting it than the other one, and it drives the other one to a lower density. And that kind of competition, where the species are simply using resources, but there's really no direct physical competition between the two species, would be referred to as exploitative competition. It's also sometimes known as resource competition, because the competitive mechanism is that the species are just consuming something that other species need. And whoever's a better competitor might have an advantage. So the mechanism here is population growth of competitors is reduced through the consumption of resources and nothing else. But if you're, for example, the mollusks in the marine situation, you've got one species that's actually physically excluding the other one directly. And that was something we would call interference competition. In this case, the resource is space, and the dominant species is just physically able to exclude the other species through direct, I'm going to push you out of the way sort of mechanism. That's interference, sometimes known as contest competition. Well, so what's different about this is that there's an active prevention of access to the resource by one competitor over the other. And in animals, this is often manifested as aggression, right? I'm going to drive you out of this habitat because I'm bigger, stronger, whatever, better at using resources. In plants, it could be something very similar. Plants don't beat each other up, but they overgrow and shade the other ones, right? So that would be a form of interference competition as well. And another way that plants do this is through allelopathy, which is chemical warfare directed not at herbivores but at other plants. So an allelopathic plant is the one that secretes inhibitory chemicals that prevent other plants from growing very successfully.
That's like black walnut around here, isn't it?
Yes, black walnuts are a great example of this. They suppress the growth of most things, which is why you don't want to near your garden. You get little stunted tomato plants that don't produce anything. So yeah, there's lots of plants that are allelopathic, but that local one is a good example. So we'll look at some examples of each of these and kind of give you a feel for how this plays out in the real world. This is a great example that's been used forever in ecology and general biology textbooks because it's such a clear-cut example of interference competition. And we're going back to the marine systems here, but this time we're just looking at barnacles and not mussels and other things. So some systems only have barnacles, right? I guess it's too many waves or something for other things to manage very well. So in this case, we've got two species of barnacles. So they're easy to recognize. They're different size and shape. And so you've got Balanus, the big one here, and Famulus, the little one. And you notice that if you look at the intertidal zone here, that they were segregated. This experiment was done way back in the 1960s, but such a great example that we use it forever. So, so you get this intertidal zone here, where the upper intertidal zone is always, for however many hours a day, exposed to the air at low tide. Right? So water goes down, the mussels up, or the barnacles up here are high and dry for a while till the water comes back up. The lower intertidal zone is usually covered with water, so it has that major difference. And you've got this obvious segregation here. And without knowing anything about this, you could look at it and pose maybe several different hypotheses for why that segregation exists. So what would you, when you look at this, what hypotheses might you come up with that would explain that segregation?
One does better without water and the other one doesn't.
Right. Right. So maybe it's not based on competition, right? You could make that assumption that, oh, this one just likes the dryness and this one doesn't like the dryness, and they're just living in their happy places, right? I can live here, you can live there.
It's also possible that the smaller barnacle can survive in both areas, but the larger barnacle pushes it out.
Okay, so that would be a competition hypothesis, that one or more of them are somehow competing and excluding the other one from its space. Right? So both of those are reasonable ideas.
The smaller one can handle wave action where the bigger one can't.
Yeah, I guess there could be more wave intensity up here, right? I'm not sure how much different that is, but it could be. So any number of things might help us understand this relationship. So now you're confronted with this scientifically. How do I test to see if competition's going on? Given the hypotheses we've just developed, could you come up with a way to determine if competition is present and explaining this relationship or not? So this is how, bringing this up here so we can have a clear understanding of how competition experiments are done to give us a clear answer as to whether or not species are competing. So what you've got to do, of course, right, is see if a species could use the available space if the other one wasn't competing with it. So how would you set that up?
You could do the one that's the upper one only, and then set it in a position where it covers the whole thing and see if it would grow on the bottom as well, or if it does need that partial dry, partial wet situation going on.
Okay, so you want to maybe clear out area here to see if this species would move into that space, right? That would work. And you'd want to do the other reverse experiment too, to see if by some chance this species is excluding that space. So that's exactly what they did, right? They go in and they take areas of rock and clear the barnacles off, both above and below, in the upper and lower intertidal zone. And what you're looking for is to see if either species changes its position and essentially moves into the space occupied by the other one. And what that would tell us is that there's evidence for competition, that when the competitor is removed, the species is doing something different than when the competitor is there. Because there's no other explanation, right? Nothing else has changed. The only thing you've done is you've removed the competitor. So, that's what was done, and what's happening here is when you take Thalamus out of the picture, Thalamus moves down. It grows into the other space. The opposite doesn't happen, right? You can remove Thalamus all day long, boundness will not grow further up the rocks into the upper intertidal zone. So, how do you interpret that result?
It's abiotically controlled by some variant that, the top one doesn't have, even though it's more tolerant of some in general than the other one.
So, okay, so which one is doing what then?
The boundless can outcompete the boundless.
Okay, so your evidence for that is that,
In the absence of boundless expands.
right, but the opposite isn't true.
So there's both competition and the thalamus, because it was threatened to extinction, it specialized to where it can tolerate the higher places on rock than the thalamus.
Okay, right, so I think that's what we would conclude here, that you take the competitive situation away, and Famulus expands its use of the rocks. The only explanation for that is that the competitor's gone, I'm going to expand my use of the resource. And this is exactly what we're looking for in any competition experiment. You can only demonstrate that competition is happening if you remove the competitor and see a compensatory response. Otherwise, you have no idea. It could just be explained by abiotic conditions alone. But what we see here is a competition of both, or a combination of both. So this species, Famulus, is being outcompeted by Balanus in most of the intertidal zone. However, it survives up here because Balanus isn't physiologically adapted to tolerate all that exposure to the dry air. For some reason, Famulus can manage it, and the other species can't. If they were both equally well adapted, what was going to happen is you'd only have one species, because it would grow all the way up to the high tide mark, and there wouldn't be any Famulus there. Right? So you have a stress tolerator, Famulus, that can tolerate the most desiccation, but that would use a lot more of the habitat if the other species wasn't outcompeting it. And this brings us to an important general point that we can use in a lot of different ecological applications. The idea of the niche, which is a description of how any species uses the available resources, right? All the different tolerance limits and what it eats and when it's active and all sorts of things like that are part of the niche. So the niche can be thought of as a volume or an area of habitat that the species uses. And this, we can think about this in a competitive situation and how big the niche is for any given species. So the niche, when we often describe it, is what the species needs and what it can use resource-wise. But when you factor in the presence of a competitor, the niche size changes because the use of resources must be different. So there are two different versions of the niche that we talk about. The fundamental niche is the version of the niche that describes the species' use of resources if no competitors are involved. And in this case, Famulus has a pretty wide fundamental niche that isn't being reflected in this competitive situation. If you took Balanus out here, it would expand its use of this resource over a much greater distance. But because the competitor is present, it's being constrained to a relatively small area. And that's what we call its realized niche. The way the resources change, resource use change, when competitive influences are factored in. So what we're looking for in a competition experiment is we're looking at what a species does, what it looks like it's doing, and see if it changes its use of the resource. And what we're actually looking for is a shift from the species' realized niche, if it's being competed walnuts. Everybody knows what those are. We have lots of them here in southwest Missouri. They're all over the place in the landscape. And they do have this chemical called juglone. And it's a growth inhibitor on other plants. So the black walnut trees secrete this stuff into the environment, mostly not so much in their leaves, but in their root systems, which makes sense, right? That's where they're competing for resources, is in the roots. So if you secrete this chemical in your root system and it leaches into the soil, it's very difficult for other plants to grow in the presence of that chemical, right? And if you're a fan of chemistry, there's the chemical structure of juglone. So the moral to that story is don't grow your garden anywhere near the root structure of a black walnut. And also don't put any composted material with juglone in your garden, like mulch, because you don't want dead leaves from a black walnut tree, or especially seed husks, because that's loaded with juglone too. It makes sense, doesn't it? You get a big old seed, black walnut seed, and the squirrel carries it away someplace and drops it, and that seed germinates with a nice big bunch of juglone around it. It gives that seed an advantage, right? It starts to germinate there, and everything growing nearby might not be able to do so well. So, anyway, but black walnuts are not the only plants that do this. There's a lot of different species of plants that are allelopathic, and this helps us understand, in some cases, why some plants are able to grow in certain conditions and not in others. So in this case, we've got some aquatic species, and I don't remember what this is about. Let's see. Okay, so we got
Tobacco aquatic?
no. So what they've done here is they have done an experiment to see in this aquatic plant situation and this terrestrial plant situation. Right, so they
Looks like they have those two species, the control group in the presence of native root chemicals and in the presence of invasive root chemicals.
right, but I'm trying to remember which is which here. This has got to be the plant that they measured the effect of the material. So this is an inhibitory, a plant that produces allelopathic chemicals. And you've got this plant. Essentially, what you've got is a control situation here, and a treatment, allelopathic chemical treatment here, in different species.
It looks like they both have a treatment. So using like root chemicals that are in the area where the plant actually grows, and then you can use these kind of plants in a different area.
Right. But what you're looking at here is you've got your mouse-ear cress, which is an aquatic plant, and then tobacco, which is probably not producing any inhibitory chemicals. So you're looking at what these plants grow, how they grow, through the influences of each of these plant chemicals. So the mouse-ear cress produces
I think both of them are being affected by chemicals.
so no chemicals here at all, right? No chemicals here at all. And then you've got the effect of the native root chemicals and the invasive plant with allelopathic capacities. And it's the mouse-ear cress is the one that's affecting overall plant growth. And then you've got the effect on the tobacco growth. And you see the same sort of result, but there's a much more inhibitory situation with this than this. So case, we can see the difference between allelopathic chemicals and non-allelopathic plants if we do side-by-side experiments in the same situation. And then we have fire, which can be indirectly be done through allelopathic chemicals, because some plants produce chemicals that promote fire, and if the plant that produces the chemicals that promotes fire is itself fire resistant, then it's got a competitive advantage. So eucalyptus is a tree that does this, and you can see how that can burn. It's extremely hot, and it's because the oils in eucalyptus are very flammable. And so what happens is you can burn the landscape pretty well in a eucalyptus forest, but the eucalyptus regenerates very quickly from the roots and from the main stem, but most other trees are just incinerated. Right, so this is an advantage to eucalyptus to have these chemicals. It doesn't inhibit the growth of plants through chemical means. It's doing it by promoting fire instead, so it's enhancing disturbance. So anyway, we'll finish this one up on Wednesday.